All right, we're going to talk about the marks of leadership tonight. We started our theme last month on organic leadership. All right, that is our whole theme for the year, is organic leadership. It's about shared life together. And in that, I talked about how leadership is not position or title. Well, if leadership is neither position nor title, then how do you identify a leader? How do you identify organic leadership? If it's something that comes from within the person, how can you say that person's a leader? Now, often churches will simply pick based on they think someone can be a leader, and so let's call them a leader, then see what happens. But there ought to be some way that you can say there's the marks of leadership in that person and find a way to develop that. And so this lesson is really about the marks of leadership, which, to be clear up front, that has nothing to do with, in particular, your calling. We'll talk about that on another lesson. It's not a personality trait, okay? It's not that. I've reduced this to 3 marks of leadership. Somewhere along the way, in the many books I've read on leadership, I came across something like this that so spoke to me, and so I wanted to share it with you. And there are 3 marks of leadership, okay? The first mark is initiative. Now, I'll use the phrase leader or leadership, follower, following. When I say follower, I don't mean someone who advocates their decision-making to another person so that they implement what that person wants them to do. Okay, that's not what I mean by following. I think following is a decision to be supportive. I think all of us have to be followers. We don't advocate decision-making, we make a decision to be supportive. And so I don't use the word follower in any sense of advocation, but of support. But also leader is more about leadership than just being a leader because you think there are leaders and there are followers. The truth is all of us should be in certain situations leading and in other situations following. That's why Paul said submit one to another. There's situations in which I'm making sure I'm being submissive, meaning supportive, all right? Where in others I might be leading. So I'm talking about leadership, not just leaders and followers in categories, if you could think in those terms, okay? And one of the first marks of leadership is initiative, whereas followers looking at something will go, I don't know what to do. And a leader will look at it and go, let's do this. They take initiative. The leader is the person out front. He looks just like everybody else, okay? But what distinguishes him is he's out front, he's bringing direction to the others, and they are in following, supporting that direction. So there's a thing called initiative. And if you want to find out where someone's leadership is, find their initiative. They used to do this in the military. I doubt if they do it any longer, but they would take a crew of new recruits who've just volunteered, come in. They would say, we're going to have to build your dorm. They get all the supplies, the tent, the poles, the stakes, all of that. They dump it on the ground and they leave. And then from a distance, they would watch which guy gets up and starts figuring out what to do with the poles, the rope, the tent, the stakes, and starts putting this together. And they go, there's your leader, there's your leader, there's your leader. They take initiative. Next thing leaders are also, they're creative. A follower says it can't be done if it can't be done the way it's always been done. See, a follower learns how it's been done, and then you look at, well, this can't be done because we've always done it this way, and now that's not going to work. A leader looks at it and is creative and comes up with an idea on how it can be done. And the third mark of leadership is excellence. By excellence, I mean an inner standard, something that is within you. A leader looks at something that's well done, that most people are happy with, and says, we really could have done this and we could have done this. We need to raise that bar a little higher. We're moving towards excellence. They have a standard inside them that calls everybody up to it. Now, this doesn't have anything to do with job title or status or position. It's going to show itself in various gifts. But these are the marks of leadership. Now, if you look at your life, just ask yourself, where do you take initiative? Where do you show creativity? Where is your standard of excellence shown? Now, when you look at those things in your life, that's where you'll find your leadership. If you're working with others and you go, who are the leaders here? First thing I look for is initiative. We are a church of leaders. We have a lot of initiative takers. And it creates its own set of problems, which are good problems, but it creates its own set of problems. You can leave something somewhere in this building and you'll never find it. People are going to take the initiative. They're going to say, oh, well, this needs to get put away. Where does it go? It goes over here. Now, it may not go over there, but they're taking the initiative, okay? That's the downside of training leaders, is you have a whole bunch of initiative takers. But the upside is you have a whole bunch of initiative takers. You don't have people sitting around waiting to be told what to do. So leadership starts with initiative. I look for initiative, then creativity, then excellence. Now we're going to look at Nehemiah tonight as our example of an initiative taker, someone with a creative view, and certainly a standard of excellence. Nehemiah, if you're not familiar with him, he has a whole book in the Old Testament. It's a great book. He was taken captive into Persia. He served the king of Persia. And he ended up coming back to Jerusalem to rebuild the wall of the city of Jerusalem, which I'll give you a little more of that in a moment. He lived from 473 BC to 403 BC. You have to count down in BC. He was 70, he lived to be 70. And this is the part I like. He was 27 years old when he led the rebuilding of the walls of Jerusalem, which would have put him right in the mid-generation. There would have been people older than him following his leadership, which I think is significant. And there would have been people younger than him following his leadership. And so Nehemiah is our example. He is the leader we're going to look at. Nehemiah, we were introduced to him in the book in chapter 1 of Nehemiah, where as a cupbearer, he's in Persia, and some people have come from Jerusalem to where he is. And it says, and they said to me, the survivors who are left from the captivity in the province are there in great distress and reproach. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down and its gates are burned with fire. Now, if I read that without putting it into any historical context, my impression is, oh my goodness, this has just happened. Their gates are torn down. These walls are broken. They're in reproach. It's like, what has happened to these poor people? Let me put this into time frame for you. Jerusalem was destroyed in 586 BC by the Babylonians. They came in, they wiped out the walls, they destroyed the temple, they took the people captive, they took the goat out of the temple, they took everything. 10 years later, in 539, the Persians conquered the Babylonians, and they took it from them. And that's why Nehemiah is serving the Persians. All right? Next, in 536, Zerubbabel leads a group back to Jerusalem. Zerubbabel is this leader who rebuilds the temple. So they start to rebuild the temple in 536. They complete the rebuilding of the temple in 516. Now, if you know much about the Old Testament, you know that Israel was sent into captivity for 70 years. And the reason it was 70 years is they violated 490 years of a 7-year Sabbath. The law of Moses says you may work 6 years. The 7th year, the land is to rest. They violated that for 490 years. And so God said, I'm giving the land 70 years of rest. And he sent them to Babylon. Now do the math. From 586 to 516 is 70 years. Now the temple is rebuilt. You follow this? Now in 446, Nehemiah hears the report we just read in Nehemiah 1. He heard in 446 BC, which is 60 years after the temple has been rebuilt. Now you look at that verse, you may have a little different view of what's going on. The survivors have learned to live for decades with the rubble around their feet. They have a rebuilt temple, but a busted down wall. Now, these are big stones. People don't carry these stones off. They just throw them down. Most of the survivors that were there grew up there. Most of them were born there. The kids probably played King of the Hill on the rocks that used to be the walls of Jerusalem. Survivors learn how to adapt to rubble. That's what survivors do. Now, the people have adapted to the rubble. Now, the word comes to Nehemiah. He hears the report, and this is what he does. He begins to pray. And so it was. When I heard these words, I sat down and I wept, and I mourned for many days. I was fasting and praying before the God of heaven. If you read Nehemiah, you will find out he fasted and prayed off and on for 4 months praying about this. This was his response to what they had learned to live with. You see the leader? He's the initiative taker. He's not adapting to the rebel. He's saying, no. He is grieved over this. He's fasting and he's praying about it. So the king of Persia, whom he was a cupbearer to, realizes Nehemiah is carrying this burden. He doesn't know what it is, but he realizes there's sadness about him. And so the king says to him, what do you request? So he said, I prayed to the God of heaven. And I said to the king, if it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in your sight, I ask that you send me to Judah, to the city of my father's tombs, that I may rebuild it. Nehemiah had prayed about it. Now he's going to do something about it. Simply praying about it without doing something about it won't get it done. Doing something about it before you pray about it is probably going to get the wrong thing done. All right? Remember, leadership's organic. You go back to the model of Jesus and the Father. Here you see Nehemiah is coming out of his relationship with God. I have prayed for months about this, and now the king's asking me, what do you want? So he said, he's getting ready to talk to the king, and you probably all have done this at one time or the other. You're in a conversation, and you're praying in your mind before the words come out of your mouth. That's what I picture Nehemiah doing. Oh, I just said, Lord, God of heaven, I want to go and I want to rebuild. He had not been there. He had not even had to live inside the rubble of the walls tore down and walk around those rocks and suffer that reproach. I'm going to go build. He's got it in his heart to do something about it. Initiative taker is what he is. So you combine prayer with your action. And he does that. So then he goes. It says, so I came to Jerusalem and I was there 3 days. Then I rose in the night, I and a few men with me. I told no one what my God had put in my heart to do at Jerusalem. Now, Nehemiah is not a lone ranger, but neither is he a poll taker. There is a difference. Those are the two extremes. The Lone Ranger says things like, I'm going to do what God tells me to do no matter what you say. Okay? The poll taker wants to find out what's going on and then try to get out in front of it. Charles used to jokingly say to pastors, there goes my people and I'm their leader. So I better catch up with them. Okay? That's a poll taker. Somebody who's trying to catch the wind and then get out in front of it. Nehemiah is neither one of those, but he goes there and he says he spends 3 days looking this thing over. Well, before you find out what people who have learned to live with the rubble and survive it have to say about it, you better assess it for yourself. You don't start asking, well, what do you think the problem is? You find out, you assess it for yourself. So Nehemiah, he's there, he's assessing it for himself. And then he starts to tell them what my God has put in my heart. If you want to know what the will of God is for your life, Don't look outside yourself. Look at what God has put in your heart. What my God has put in my heart. This has come out of my relationship with God, and he has put it into me to do this. Often I find people who are looking for direction are looking out here. Okay? It places you in a very vulnerable position for someone to come up to you and say, I know the will of God for your life. And you're like, oh, finally, someone's going to tell me the will of God. Okay? Well, it's in your heart. God shapes your heart. And God has put this into my heart, he says. That's where the guidance is coming from. It's not when I say within him, he's not making it up. He's making it clear, God put this in me. Another example of this we could use is Jeremiah the prophet. More Jeremiah, if you want to read this guy was tough. They put him in a pit up to his arms, a well, okay, up to his armpits, basically. I got that backwards. Anyway, they got, okay. And he says, Lord, I don't want to talk anymore. I'm done talking for you. Every time I do, they do something bad to me. And then he says, it's like fire shut up in my bones. I couldn't keep quiet. See, the direction was coming from within. What is God doing in you? That's where your initiative is. The initiative isn't, oh, this is what I want to do. The initiative is, what is God giving you? What has God put in you? That's where your initiative is going to be. And at first you might not even recognize it's from the Lord, but then as time goes by, you realize it keeps stirring and it keeps stirring. And at times you think, I don't even know if I want to do this, but it just keeps stirring and stirring. It's not you. The direction's coming from the Lord. Nehemiah knows this. So I've told them what God had put in my heart, he says. Now look at this. I told them the hand of my God which had been good upon me, and also the king's words which he had spoken to me. And they said, these are the people who had learned to live in the rubble for decades. They said, let us rise and build. And then they set their hands to this good work. It would have been easy for Nehemiah to look at the people after looking at the rubble and say, they're not going to do anything about this. There's no way I'm going to get these people to work on putting this wall back together. But instead, what he does, he shares with them what God had put in his heart. He shares with them how the hand of God has been with him. Okay? He doesn't come in telling them, you ought to do this. If your approach is ought to, then you're not going to lead people. They will just push back against your ought to. Nehemiah came with a testimony of what God had shown him and how he dealt with him, and it sparked a want to in them. Even people who have learned to live in the rubble want it fixed. They just didn't have the leadership to get it done. And so they then rise up and say, let us build. You notice it starts out with Nehemiah saying to the king, send me, I want to rebuild. And now they're saying, let us rebuild. They're joining into this. The leader should spark in people the very thing that God has sparked in the leader, that answers to what God is doing in them. That's what Nehemiah does. It's working with the Spirit of God. And what God is doing in leaders and within what God is doing in his people, they are complementary one to another, and they work together. So the people now are responding. They're starting to put their hands to the work. This is initiative showing, starting with Nehemiah and now spreading to the people. It's a great example. And it's all voluntary. It's organic. This is just spontaneous. It's happening. The next thing is creativity. Sanballat, who opposes the work, says, what does this bunch of poor, feeble Jews think they're doing? Do they think they can build the wall in a single day by just offering a few sacrifices? Do they think they can make something of stones from a rubbish heap and charred ones at that? Now, Sanballat was only saying what the Jews who had lived there for years had already believed. Sanballat is telling them, you don't have the strength, you don't have the time, and you don't have the resources. You can't do this work. You're just too feeble. You think you're going to do it in one day? You don't have the time to get this done. Who do you think you are? They had told themselves this. See, the devil will tell you what you had believed to try to stop you from rising up out of the rubble to build what God has for you. And so Sanballat does this. Now, I'd say that Nehemiah is creative here because Nehemiah is looking at the same stones that Sanballat and the other Jews had looked at, and Nehemiah sees a wall. I like the way it's worded in the New King James. Here it says charred ones. In the New King James, it says burnt stones. Okay? This church started with burnt stones. Half of us were burned out. But God put us back in the wall. And I picture this wall as looking like a checkerboard. Okay? Now, when Sanballat is mocking it, he's mocking the fact this wall's got charred stones. These are burnt stones. Now, you know anything about burnt stones, they don't disintegrate unless you've got some really hot fire, which they wouldn't have had that hot of a fire. So they just get charred. And so when he starts building this wall, they don't bring in a bunch of brand new stones. They go around where these stones have been piled up. They pick them up and they start putting them back into the wall. And you got this checkerboard wall going up around Jerusalem. They're building together. Nehemiah sees the wall. He doesn't worry whether they're charred or not. He sees that burnt stones can be put back into the wall. And that's true of people. Someone comes to us who's burned out. Just don't just quote, sit down and rest, we'll take care of you. God has a purpose for you. We're going to help you get back in the wall and what God has for you. So Nehemiah is seeing this creatively. They didn't. They had seen it just as destruction, and Sanballat's appealing to that, but Nehemiah's not having any of it. They're going to build. So they continued to build. So they start building the wall, and the entire wall was joined up to half its height, for the people had a mind to work. This is the danger point. It is at this point that Sanballat and those who are with him threaten to attack. The people start having some divisions among them at this point, if you read this story in Nehemiah. Nehemiah has to get everybody together, and what he does is he's a brilliant strategist in this. He has every family stationed in the wall now. One half is working while the other half holds a sword to defend in case of attack. All right? It's at this point, though, at half the height, where many of the people would probably have been pretty happy if Nehemiah had just said enough. Sanballat will back off, we'll have peace through compromise. He'll back off. We'll be able to get on with our lives. And after all, it's halfway up, okay? But the leader isn't happy with halfway. The standard of leadership is excellence. You follow this? So let me show you this on my simple graph of leadership. This is the Pete graph of excellence. Halfway up is good enough. That's good enough. Halfway up, and maybe even the majority of people, at least half, maybe 51%, will say that's good enough. Nehemiah, you did good enough. You got the wall halfway. We feel safer. We feel better about ourselves. We're not as reproached as we were before. That's good enough. So we're going to put that as the mean, right in the middle. The middle mean standard. Now, below good enough is just enough. Just enough is very frustrating. I've found that people who do just enough are often some of the most gifted people. and they turn it on when they need to, and they do just enough. And you see the potential that the person has, but they're happy with the standard of just enough. And it's one of the most frustrating things is to try to help develop someone who's happy with just enough when you know they have callings and gifts and grace in their life that God could use in a great way. But as long as they're happy with just enough, they'll never be leaders, because that's not the standard of leadership. Now, above good enough is better than most. This is, we're here in this great middle section of the church. We're doing okay. And we're better than most. A lot of churches are losing members. We're not growing as fast as we like, but we're better than most. We're growing some, okay? What we do is, it's maybe it isn't just wonderful, but it's better than most. It's certainly better than most churches our size. We do better than most, okay? That's a standard that's above, good enough. It is better than most, but it isn't the standard of leadership. The standard of leadership is excellence. Now, above excellence is perfection. Vince Lombardi, who was the coach of the Green Bay Packers, who won 3 championships in a row, Green Bay Packer over there. Vince Lombardi had a quarterback, Bart Starr. When Bart Starr first met Vince Lombardi at their first team meeting, he told the team, we're going to aim for perfection, realizing no one ever attains it, but we will achieve excellence in the pursuit of it. Okay? And he was happy with excellence. A perfectionist is never happy with excellence. Okay? You can aim above excellence for perfection, but if you achieve excellence, you better be happy with it, because the people around you have put out a lot to get to that excellent standard. Okay? And so excellence is your standard that you're really going to hit. Well, you might even aim higher than that. Excellence is what should be our standard, and it doesn't come from around you. If your standard is based on people's response, you're not leading them, you are following them. If your standard is based on people's response, your standard, you're not leading them, you're following them. To the person who says, well, it's good enough, you know what that person's thinking? Most people are okay with it. It's good enough. If it's better than most even, most people are going to say, whoa, that was real, I like that. There's times, I can reduce this even to a message. I'll have people make a comment and say, that was really good, and I'm not happy with it. Okay? And I realize it probably shows on my face. I try to hide it, okay? To be, grateful and to say, thank you, I'm glad you got something out of that, because I didn't think I delivered it very well. Thank the Lord. The Holy Spirit bridged the gap between me and you. We're grateful for that. But if you've hit what God has in you, the mark, you know it. And there are times where I knew I hit the mark and someone says, I didn't get that. I thought, I did. I know that God had something for it and somebody got something out of it. Okay, when you know that, that's excellence. You've got to have an inner standard, not the standard of what's coming from around you. That's what's in the leader. Nehemiah has this. He doesn't stop at halfway. He continues to build and to stand there with sword, if they needed to fight to get the building done. So now look at this. So the wall was finished on the 25th day of Elul in 52 days. Now they had lived with this wall on the ground for 60 years. And they rebuilt it in 52 days. I wonder if these people thought, boy, how dumb are we? We could have had this built a long time ago. It's amazing what people can achieve when you're in unity. It is just amazing how fast a progress can happen. So in 52 days, they build this. And it happened when all our enemies heard of it and all the nations around us saw these things, that they were disheartened in their own eyes. It starts out with, we are reproach in our eyes, and now they're disheartened in their own eyes. For they perceived that this work was done by our God. Motive. Nehemiah did his share. So did the people. They did their share. And it isn't wrong to commend one another for doing our part and say, that was a job well done. Thank you for that work, the sacrifice, the giving, the preparation work, the making sure it was done to excellence. That's a good thing to encourage and commend one another. But ultimately, the motive has to be to glorify God and to give testimony to Him. That's ultimately what it has to be, or it is about us. And Nehemiah's got the right motive. It shows here, this work was done by our God. And he knew God was in it from the beginning. He is a great example of an initiative taker, a person with a standard of excellence, and who is creative. So here's the questions for you. What is it that you do that no one told you to do? That's where you're taking initiative. If someone has to tell you to do it, you're not leading it. You're implementing the leadership of another person. Now, even if you take it from that point and run with it, but if it comes from within you, that's initiative. What do you do that no one told you to do? The extra work you put into a lesson. You don't have to do, but you do it because you want to bridge that communication gap. You want to make sure that word gets in to the adults or to the children. What do you do that no one told you to do? What have you done that others thought couldn't be done? There's always someone who'll tell you you can't do it. They just will. I don't know if they feel called of God to do this to you. I don't know. Okay? But there's always seems to be someone who'll say, you can't do it. You can't lead a cell. You don't have enough leadership in you to lead a cell. Well, how much leadership does it take? It takes love. Okay. It takes praying. Okay. It takes following Jesus. Okay. And then it takes helping others follow Jesus because you pray and you love them. I think you can do it. I'm convinced that every Christian who is truly following the Lord can actually lead others to follow the Lord. And ultimately, that is what cell leadership has to be about. That's what all leadership has to be about. What have you done that others thought couldn't be done? What is it that you do that goes beyond what anybody expects of you? That extra work you put in, that thing that drives you, what is it that you do? Now, when you know that answer to those questions, that's where you're going to find your leadership. And then when you find that, you start giving yourself to it. A number of people over the years have asked me, why did you go to school? I ask myself that a lot of times, okay? Because I love the Word of God. Because I love sharing the Word of God. Because I want to understand it and grow in that. No one made me do it. Okay, there's no non-denominational pastor in the whole world that I know of who was required to go to the schooling I went to at St. Louis U. I wanted to. That's why I went. I wanted to. What do you do that you love to do? Who makes you practice your instrument for hours? Well, when you're a kid, maybe your parents, but after that, there's something that's driving you, that's pulling you forward into it. You just go down the list. What do you do that no one makes you do? What is your standard of excellence in doing that? Who's making you to hold to that standard? Or does it come from within you? This is where your leadership's going to be. Now, when I can find where a person's initiative is, where their creativity is, and where their excellence is, I do everything I can to get the resources to them to turn them loose. Okay? They are going to be an asset and a blessing to the church, to the kingdom, to people. None of them are going to be a threat to me. Everyone I've ever supported to excel in the thing that they love the most has always turned around and blessed me. And the thing that they may love the most, I might not have a clue what it's all about, especially if it involves math. It involves music. I like music, but I don't know a C note from an F note. I think there's an E note. I don't know. Thank you. There is an E note. So you find people around you who have different areas than you. See, when you understand organic leadership, you'll understand the point isn't to make clones of yourself. The point is to find that what is in that person and find a way to release that and help them develop it. Okay? And the frustration can be is sometimes people are interested in things that you don't think they ought to really, like, why is that your interest? But it is what God's put in their heart. You have to let them be who they are and grow in that. Now, if a church can do this, I promise you that Jesus, who's the head of the body, will put the members together. There's in 1 Corinthians 12, Paul writes about the members of the body that the eye cannot say to the hand, I have no need of you. Remember the verse? Hand-eye coordination. The eye sees, the hand grasps. For every seer, there better be a bunch of hands. Because when the seer sees something, it's a vision big enough that's going to put a lot of people to work. So the eye cannot achieve what it sees without people who are also the hands. The head cannot say to the feet, I have no need of you. Paul also wrote, well, the head and the feet go together because what the head thinks the feet walk into. You see the connection? So there'll be different members in the body, but the Lord will put the body together. I think that's the real issue for why people don't get and understand organic leadership. It's because we want to frame it the way we want it done. All right? And the challenge is to let it grow according to the gifts of the people that are there and what God has put in their hearts. And then you adapt it to that. This church is different today than it was 10 years ago, than it was 20 years ago, because you're different. And there's different people that have been added to us. And it's going to be different 10 years from now. So if you fix it in your mind as this is it, then you're going to become the problem. Okay? You can't do that. You have to let the new generation come up and find a way to express what God has put in them. Nehemiah was 27. I wonder how many 47-year-olds laughed at him. No, he ain't going to do this. No way. He's this kid. But he did it. Okay, you either make room for the Nehemiahs or they'll just move on without you. Because that's the nature of organic leadership. If the generation that's in leadership doesn't make room for emerging leaders, the emerging leaders will find expression elsewhere. Now, the existing generation may label them rebels, but the problem really is the existing generation becomes a bottleneck. And you can never be that. And that is not an issue of age. That's an issue of attitude. That's what that is. Because I've seen younger generation get a bad attitude that you'd think would be in somebody who's been around for 50 years. But the most flexible guy I think I've ever worked with is Charles Simpson. My goodness, the man was 86, walking with the Lord when the Lord took him, and he's still flexible. So it's attitude is what it is. So you have to go with it and grow with it so that the life can produce what God has for us. But it's going to show coming up out of people. It's not going to fall down on you. It's going to rise up from you. That's what's going to happen. And you have to support one another in it. But I think everyone has leadership. I think everyone also is to be a follower. Because God doesn't give everything to one person. Okay? That's by design, obviously. So everyone has leadership. It's just a question of you finding what God's put in your heart to do. Then that's where your initiative, creativity, and excellence is going to show.